5.4 talks about creating the work breakdown structure, where we just left 5.3. And basically, we're breaking down the project deliverables into smaller, more manageable components. And just to recall, the decomposition continues until we can expose the risk of completing whatever that package is at that point. The lowest WBS element in the work breakdown structure itself is called the work package. And we refer to all elements in the tree itself as a work breakdown structure component, or WBSC. And for a WBSC, there has to be at least one defined deliverable, and that's the definition of a WBSC. A deliverable comes out at the other end. And we're going to use that in quality control for getting sign-off. We have to agree that the deliverable was done appropriately. And that's going to work into our earned value, which is going to be how we measure the progress of the project itself. The bottom nodes of the WBS, the leaves at the terminals, are the work packages. Okay, so 5.4 looks something like this. The input is the scope management plan and the project scope statement and the requirements specification document, plus enterprise environmental factors and organizational process assets. Then we're going to basically do the decomposition as best we can, and then we're going to output the actual scope baseline, the work breakdown structure itself, and the project document updates. Now we can ask a question, why bother doing a WBS anyways? Well, here are some of the consequences of having a poor breakdown structure, or indeed none at all. You're not going to define the project work completely, which means you're going to have to ad hoc and ad lib it further on down in the project, which means extensions to the timeline and increase the cost. The work assignments will not be clear. The goals, objectives, deliverables will not be clear. Scope almost by definition has to creep because we haven't defined it all. So there's going to be a lot of scope changes, and that's not a good thing, people. There's going to be budget overruns, missed deadlines, timeline slippage, probably create a product that's unusable, and fail to deliver some of the elements that were expected in the scope. Now, the relationship of the WBS, all these guys are intimately related. The project charter, for example, begins with a rough breakdown of the WBS. The project scope statement leads directly into it. There may be a program WBS of which this project is a part. We're going to have a resource breakdown structure, and there's a lot of star BSs here. Oh, I like that phrase, a star BS. This basically tells us how the resources are going to be allocated. And the organizational breakdown structure is how the company actually structures people in its organization. We're going to define a thing called the WS dictionary, and this is going to lead to the project network diagram and the project schedule, which we'll define in the next 2 units. So this is fundamental to the work we're doing. The charter, as we mentioned, was the starting point for the WBS, and the WBS's highest level element is the charter's overall endpoint product, and that should be clearly defined. The scope statement here, the higher level elements of the WBS should match word for word for the corresponding scope-defined outcomes. If you can't do that, and probably the scope statement is fatally flawed and we got to change it. The PMO may have a bunch of projects that are being rolled up into a program, and they may have their WBS as part of the program, and this has to be basically an elaboration of some subset of the parent WBS. And so if the scope of the program changes, the impact on this particular project we can see easily to make sure that the two structures are aligned. This basically is how we map people onto the project team, and we use the RBS to allocate people to do the work packages. All team members have appropriate work packages, and each work package has an owner, and this is huge. When we talk about an owner, what we mean is that somebody is responsible for the execution of that work package. Could be the project manager. More likely, it's a team member with expertise in that area. Now, one of the ways we can build our resource breakdown structure is to use what the PMBOK calls the RACI format. RACI stands for R responsible, B, accountable, C, consultative, and I, informative. And so basically the idea here is that suppose we've got 5 people that are working on the project team, and we take a look at the actual activities. The definition of the project is basically Ann is accountable to management for getting that done. Ron is responsible for doing it. Carlos and Dina and Ed need to know that's being done so we can consult with them. And so on for each one of these elements. We can see that we're going to have an Iraqi format for each one. And in fact, it may possibly be a blank if there's no relationship at all for Ed, for example, to know about the testing. The organizational breakdown structure basically is the diagram of the organization's hierarchy. So we start, for example, if we did the Catholic Church, then we would have the Pope at the top, and then Curia underneath him, and then cardinals underneath him, bishops under the cardinals, and so on. And in fact, this is basically organized by people, and where they sit in the hierarchy, the work breakdown structure is organized by deliverables, and both have their appropriate spot in the project and in the organization. Now, the WBS itself is a diagram, like a big bushy tree, and associated with that is what we call the WBS dictionary, and this contains information about each work breakdown structure component. So there's a detailed description of the work that has to be done, there's a list of the deliverables, then there's going to be a subset of the work here called activities, which we'll see a bit later when we talk about scheduling. Each WBSC starts at the beginning, leads to a deliverable out at the other end, and then it may take several activities to actually create that deliverable, which they themselves don't create deliverables, so they're not a WBSC component, but they're a subcomponent of this particular one, and that hopefully will become clear a bit further on down. We need to indicate milestones here, which are basically major deliverables of the project. The dictionary also maps numbers onto English names that are descriptive of what we're doing. The WBS numbers indicate where in the hierarchy you're going to place this guy, and then the English name is what the descriptor is saying what it's supposed to do. We can also indicate the resources that have been allocated, charge numbers or charge accounts, for example, for accounting, and lots of different things like that. Now, the network diagram is going to be the temporal, which means the timeline-based sequential arrangement of the WBSCs, such as the Gantt or a PERT chart or something like that, which is a pictorial description with the horizontal time axis running from the beginning of the project to the end, and each individual WBSC indicates where it lives on that time diagram. And the nice thing about the network diagram is it can help us with the work breakdown structure. Maybe we've done an incomplete decomposition. Maybe we've assigned too much effort for a particular item. Maybe we've got more than one person responsible, which is not a good thing. You want only a single person responsible for each WBSC. We can indicate risk, and we can indicate project dependencies, and this is going to be a key artifact of the project. The WBS and the corresponding dictionary is mandatory to develop the schedule. That's why it's important. Now, the decomposition for the tools and techniques, we break things down into deliverables into smaller, more manageable components until we can see the work that needs to be done and identify the risk associated with it. We continue until we can do the estimation of cost and time to get it completed. Or, as we said, another criterion is until you can see the complete risk exposure. So here's what we do. We identify the major deliverables of the project, and the life cycle is a good place to start. It's going to say, these are the major milestones that have to be accomplished. Then, can the times and cost for this deliverable be calculated now? If we can do that, yippee, we hop down to 4. If we can't, then we break that deliverable into its constituent components and subdeliverables and go back to 2. And we keep doing this breakdown until we can reliably estimate the cost and the time. And then at the bottom, when we finally get through this, we verified the correctness of the decomposition through a walkthrough or an inspection. Each WBSC has to have 6 criteria. The status and the completion have to be measurable. We have to know how far along we are and how close to being completed, and indeed if we are completed, we have to be able to measure that. There have to be clearly defined start and end events. Now they can slip in the sense that we can start no later than or must start after and things like that, but we have to be able to specify a start and an end date. There has to be a deliverable, at least one, coming out at the end of the WBSC. The time and cost to do that WBSC has to be easily and reliably estimated. Duration has to be within acceptable limits, and that's defined by the timeline of the projects. And finally, work assignments for the project team have to be independent of each other. So when I'm doing a WBSC, I'm not dependent on any other work assignments on any other elements being done, just the one that I'm completing here. The verifications are the lower level items necessary and sufficient to complete the decomposed item. Is each item clearly and completely defined? Can each item be scheduled, costed, assigned to an organizational unit, aka a human being, to do? Has the sign-offer been ID? For each one of these, we have to indicate the name and function of the WBSC. We have to specify the input and output criteria and the mapping results we expect. We have to show that each of the previous 6 criteria have been met, and we have to do this for every single item in the work breakdown structure, and this is critical that we do this. Expert judgment here, the work breakdown structure basically allows us to integrate the details of the individual clumps or endpoints of the breakdown structure and the deliverables with all the other parts of the project. So in fact, the initiating, the planning, the execution, all those other aspects are going to come back to the WBS and the WBSC. Now, some of the benefits of a deliverable-oriented WBS, which is very close to an oxymoron, we get better communication with sponsors, stakeholders, and team members. We're using the same vocabulary to describe what's going on in the project. We're going to get more accurate estimation of tasks and risks and costs and timelines, and we're going to have an increased confidence that all of the work necessary to complete the project, to deliver the product, has been identified. It has a big role in supporting clarity, because now we're decomposing the scope, which is general, into deliverables, which are quite specific. So this supports the definition of the work effort required for effective management. We're defining the scope in terms of concrete items that everyone on the team and all the stakeholders can understand. It relates the WBSCs to the organizational breakdown structure and the responsibility assignment matrix. It permits the measurement of the project's progress, status, projected performance, and allows us to estimate when the project's going to finish and what it's going to cost based on the estimates that we've obtained on working on the project to date. And then we can also use the work breakdown structure for process improvement. If we want to find root cause analysis when we find a defect, we can go back and find out where was that defect introduced into the actual work breakdown structure. WBS levels are hierarchical. The depth is dependent on the size and complexity of the project and on the level of detail needed, and this is something you'll only be able to do as you actually work on the WBS itself. Hagen, in an article in 2002 in Crosstalk, that's the U.S. Journal for Military Software Engineering, included what he called a 100% rule. WBS includes 100% of the work defined by the project scope and captures all deliverables, internal deliverables, external, interim, etc. And in fact, we have to do that for every WBSC in the WBS. Here's an example of a breakdown from the PMBOK for an air navigation system here. where here you can see the support equipment is broken into project management, training, data, air vehicle, etc. Project management is broken into systems engineering and supporting project management artifacts. The air vehicle down here into airframe, engine, communication, navigation system, fire control, etc. Now the WBS is hierarchical in that each subroute is a decomposition of a bigger item, so they all kind of roll up into each other. So a natural way to do this is basically to define the project itself as being at level 0, and then basically level 1, level 2, level 3 to be major sublevels in the hierarchy. So for example, 1.1 and 1.2 and 1.3 would be 3 WBSCs at level 1 of the hierarchy. Now you can see that we need that dictionary to map this number sequence, which tells you what level of the WBS this item is located at, and the symbolic name as to what the function of that WBSC actually is. Now, in terms of templates, we could have a product-oriented organization, or a phase-oriented organization, or a function-oriented organization. And you can find templates for these on the actual internet itself. So here, for example, to go back to the airframe example we had before, here are the basically 7 major top-level decompositions of support equipment. And then these are the guys under each one here. So for example, under airframe equipment, these are 4.1, 4.2, and they need to be mapped back as we saw before. Now the spatial order of going from one level to another can be used in different ways. One way is to basically arbitrarily say, okay, this is level 1 and this is a breakdown into sub-level 1 here. Or we could indicate it like this, indicated that basically this element has to be done before this and has to be done before this. Now, there are a lot of acronyms that we're throwing around here. Don't confuse WBS with other acronyms. The contract WBS, when we talk about contracting, we'll talk about this, is basically a work breakdown structure with far less details. In other words, we would not go very far into the decomposition tree. The OBS is the organizational breakdown structure, or you think, for example, of the example of the Catholic Church, Pope down all the way to priest, down to parishioner. Then BOM is bill of materials, which sometimes is used in the construction industry. The RBS is the resource breakdown structure of how the resources are allocated. And in fact, the PBS, the project breakdown structure, is just another word for WBS. And so here's another example of the PMBOK here with a bunch of phases and deliverables being delivered. The output from all of this is now going to be the scope statement, the WBS, and the WBS dictionary. So this is huge. Then the final section is, the final 2 sections are to validate the scope and to control the scope, and that will be the topic of our next subunit.